Good morning. I am so happy to be here today. We are happy to be here today, to be able to have a conversation, and share a bit about our stories and why we're here, what brought us here, and my path is always moving toward liberation, and so how we can join together and what liberation looks like for all of us, even in those uncomfortable moments where we are asking everyone to lean in to that discomfort in order to move us toward a place of true liberation for all of us.
So just to put a little more background in terms of my journey and what brings me to this conversation with Erica. When I was 28, I got a booklet from my grandmother about my family history, our family history, mostly stuff she was proud of, but to her credit, she put in 2 sentences about our ancestors having been slave traders. And this is a Rhode Island family. So I had the initial massive shock. I had an immediate second shock, which was realizing that I already knew and had repressed it. And then I had this subsequent, upon going and reading more about it, shock of, oh my God, they were not the exception in the North. They were part of a huge pattern of Northern complicity in slavery that I, for one, was not taught in school. And everyone I talked to was not taught in school. So it sent me on a journey to dig into this and to really try to come to terms with how, in fact, our family was a microcosm of this larger phenomenon of Northern amnesia about slavery. And if you learn about the North dominating the slave trade, Rhode Island being the leading slave trading state, if you learn about how there was slavery in the North for 200 years, if you learn about how even after slavery, it was Northern factories that were processing raw materials from the South and from the islands, like sugar and coffee and cotton, then you see that the whole economy of the nation, not just the South, was built on enslavement. And that was a huge reframe for me in terms of who has responsibility in the present day. So in a nutshell, I decided to make a documentary film about it because it felt like a story that was much larger than me and my family. And I invited relatives to come with me on a journey to retrace the triangle trade. And 9 brave folks came with me, and the 10 of us went to Rhode Island and Ghana and Cuba, where the DeWolfs owned plantations. And we can get into more of this conversation, but needless to say, it just completely shifted my understanding of myself, my people, white privilege, legacies of slavery, the shadow, as Therese talked about. So the film came out, Traces of the Trade, a story from the Deep North, came out in 2008 on PBS. And traveling with it to schools and churches and whatnot has also been a huge education, for which I'm very grateful.
And I would say for me, as a Black woman, I do not identify as a person of color. I do not identify as a person of color. I am a Black woman. I am African, born at Howard University Hospital. I know my descendants in a way, and in particular, and even just sitting here, I know I didn't share this with you. I think I may have shared a bit of it with you, but I want to say when I was about maybe 23, my grandfather shared with me that he was going on a journey of identifying our genealogy. And during one of our family reunions, he gave us all a packet that had a slave log and census and identified our family members. He also gave us a printout that said the name of the person who had enslaved our family. And his name was Thomas W. Goodrich. So my maiden name is Goodrich. And we had Goodrich Family Reunion on our shirts at that moment. And so from that point, and it's still very emotional for me to to see the person and to see the name and to know that it's a name that I still carry. That we added such value to the name beyond our value on the plantation, the value that we created for our family, and our legacy. But there is, in thinking about that cognitive dissonance, there's still that anger and that hurt and sadness to know that this name that I carry is from someone who owned us, who did not see us as human, did not see our value beyond what we could produce. And so when we look at our work with Black Lives, do you have any tissue? Black Lives Matter. And ultimately this is, because I don't talk about this particular part often, but in thinking about, thank you, in thinking about the connections with our stories, that we are all impacted by this. And oftentimes when we turn that part off, or if we want to dismiss it and say, well, my family didn't do that. But then you think about and when we talk about ancestors, when you open with that when we do ancestral work, we're tapping into all of our ancestors. And so when Africans do ancestral work, and we know the strength of our ancestors and the power behind it, and being able to call on the most noble and powerful ancestors, that there are ancestors also on the other side that are working as well. And so to know that that is something that we have to tap into and recognize that, we are not asking for you to apologize or anyone to apologize for their ancestors. But what we are asking is that you dismantle the systems that they created, that you maintain passively or actively, and that you benefit from. That's what it is. Because we are still impacted from those same systems that are in place. And so in doing this work, there's a passion that comes with us and with me that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Because there is no fear. We don't fear death. I don't fear death. Because they're already killing us. And so in thinking about when we talk about the internal and external factors of how we see systemic racism, internally, when I think about it, there's a quote that came up for me, and I hold these spaces every week. And I hold them for other people. There aren't many spaces for people that are doing healing work to be able to come and share. And so oftentimes I have to go to Cuba or go to South Africa next month or go to somewhere else out of the country to be able to get the things that I need to be able to maintain space for Black people to process their racial stress and trauma. And so in thinking about the internal, I thought about a quote from Audre Lorde. And it said, the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. And so in thinking about the internal work of systemic racism, I've had to identify the oppressor within. In what ways have I internalized white supremacy to the point where I am either operating in anti-Blackness or colorism or sexism, all these different things, because being in a patriarchal society, this is something that we can embody as well, that women can absolutely be a part of and complicit in patriarchy and projected as well. And the same with internalized racism. So in which ways, and many Black folks know when you might have that one relative that is like, Black people always, and then it's something negative, right? That's internalized racism. And we have been taught that. And so being able to create a space where we can unpack that has been a crucial part of my work in emotional emancipation as a spiritual life coach, as someone who has the ancestor Harriet Tubman with her every day that says all the time, you're going to be free or else. And so I've had to, in that vein, that could be intense. And so bringing in that softness of other ancestors to be able to create a space for people to be able to share how they've internalized racism in a space where it's no judgment, that people are able to move at the pace in which, not that they are comfortable, but when things come up, they have the tools and strategies not to suppress it and to not put that mask back on that we walk in the world with. Often, those of us who are not fully on that path to liberation, there's a mask that we wear and that we've been taught to wear for our survival, for a job. And this is a space, the spaces that I create are spaces for Black folk, particularly to be able to take off the mask and say the things that you have been wanting to say for 30, 40, or 50 years and haven't had the language or haven't had the space to be affirmed and to be held in that and to not have it be rejected or dismissed as, well, no, that's not racism, that might be classism. Like those things are not intersected and that they don't impact us all in various ways and in multiple ways. So that's been a part of my work and my journey and in thinking about that internal work and thinking about your path. And I know you're going to share some of the internal pieces. My question, and I'm hoping that we can be able to dig into this further in this festival, is I know what healing has looked like for me on the internal. What does the healing look like for you as you're going on this path? What did it look like, or what does it look like for you and your family members?
Thank you for asking that, because it is a separate journey, but it is about healing at a very deep level. And recent research by brain scientists tells us that much of our mental activity is unconscious. So the unconscious that Jung talks about, we now actually understand that better. So in order to even do the healing, you have to bring from the unconscious to the conscious mind things that are swirling inside. And those can be emotions, and of course also what we now call unconscious or implicit bias. So I think a real roadblock for a lot of people who I affectionately call people of power, my beloved fellow people of power, not power. People sometimes hear that wrong and think I'm saying power, although one could say people of power and power. But in any case, we usually think that the word racism means intentional racism, and therefore we say, I'm not racist, because we consciously, intentionally disavow racism. What we don't realize is that in our unconscious mind, we have absorbed all these messages from society, from the media, that just penetrate and stick because of the way the brain works. And those, if you're, as we know these days, a white police officer, a landlord, an employer, a doctor, all of these positions of power, and you haven't brought more consciousness to your unconscious biases, then they will rule the day. And that has major impacts, like teachers and their low expectations of children of color. One prime example. And actually, allow me to say, I am very focused on Black-white divide issues because of my family history. I just want to acknowledge that obviously white privilege and racial inequity applies to many more groups in America. And hopefully the things that I'm saying, even though they're drawn out of my experience of looking at the legacy of slavery, are applicable more broadly. But so to further answer your question of what the healing looks like, I'm particularly convinced that we need to just up our emotional intelligence as white folks and our resilience I don't know if folks have heard Robin DiAngelo's term that she uses, white fragility. We can be ever so fragile. And it's okay to actually, part of that, this is sort of a little bit of a Buddhist concept of like name it and accept it before you try to get rid of it. I think we tend to associate white folks with power, and therefore one can assume about ourselves, or as you look at us, there can be an assumption that our internal landscape is a powerful, self-confident landscape. There's certainly some of that. We get raised with a lot of entitlement, for example, many of us. But at the same time, there are all these vulnerable emotions. Guilt, shame, defensiveness, anxiety, not wanting to seem racist, fear of saying the wrong thing. These very vulnerable emotions that if we don't notice them and process them, preferably not with people of color.
Yeah, y'all gotta work that out.
So if we start to lean on each other more, instead of a typical response as a white person when we're first becoming more conscious is to like gravitate towards people of color because we want them to make us feel better and validate.
And let me tell you what that is. That's exploitation of labor. Yeah. You are expecting us to help you unpack all your stuff for free.
Yep, there was an African-American woman at the seminary I went to, Pacific School of Religion, who, as things were kind of exploding on race issues, she kept being turned to by faculty and administrators and everybody, can you come help solve this? And she's like, are you paying me? Or last I checked, I was paying to attend this school. So, yes. So I think that healing, a lot of it is about that emotional, getting emotionally stronger, which can often be by acknowledging the vulnerable feelings with each other and leaning on each other more and admitting the fear.
Yeah. There's so much here, and I wish we even had more time to be able to dig deeper. One of the things, as far as moving forward with the external, and there's, again, so much more with the internal, and why there is a need for spaces that are mixed spaces, but there's also a need for us to go into our own areas and communities and ethnic groups to be able to unpack in all those areas anti-Blackness, because it's within us. Because again, as you were saying, growing up in a society where it is focused on white supremacy and pushing that in media, in beauty, in education, in history, that is absorbed by white folks and other folks, and that is absorbed by Black folks. And when you think about white supremacy, that dichotomy is the Black is on the other side of the spectrum. And so folks that are in the middle, there's this idea, and some of you may have heard, that proximity to whiteness, that the more you are able to assimilate via skin color, via whatever it may be, there are people that reject Blackness because they want to be able to survive in a system, because the system that tells you that Black is the worst thing that you can be or embody. And so there is a direct shifting to try to go to the side that is more acceptable, which is a lie even, because no matter what it is that you do, how can I say, so white supremacy is so insidious that white people don't even have to be around for it to impact you. And so that's the importance of having being able to go within and ask yourself these deep self-reflective questions about what is it that I have internalized about myself that causes me to be in bondage, to not see myself as exactly what the Creator has designed me to be. And it's not to be anything else but who I am, and to stand in that. And so in thinking about the external piece, so when you are doing that work internally, identifying systemic racism internally, when you are doing that work and you are freeing yourself, it's been my experience that walking in a world that is also complicit in systemic racism can be very difficult when you know that you are liberated, that you are free. And you are walking in the world in that freedom, and you recognize the lie. So the lie of Black inferiority, that's again something that we've internalized, that many of us are healing from, particularly in the state of the Black Lives Matter movement. And even, so walking through the world as a liberated Black woman makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And it's kind of funny to see the reactions, to know what is expected of me, and to really move in my liberation, and to see how that makes other people uncomfortable. Makes a lot of people uncomfortable, not just white folks. Makes a lot of Black folks uncomfortable too, because they're like, shh, you're not supposed to say that. You can't, you're supposed to whisper white folks. You can't say it out loud. You know, or my grandmother still, you know, does this, or says, you know, W people. And I'm like, who's W people? Like, we can say white. It is okay. So there's all of that as well. But the external piece, in looking at that, another quote comes to mind. And I just consume Black feminist literature. That is something that I've been raised in, and understanding intersectionality as well. So that's a way that I operate and move through the world, of identifying and understanding the power of Black queer feminist thinkers, and so many others in our community. And so in thinking about this, the external quote that came to mind, that I share with everyone, is by Zora Neale Hurston, where it says, if you are silent about your pain, people will kill you and say you enjoyed it. Yes, it needs to be said again, right? If you are silent about your pain, people will kill you and say you enjoyed it. And so what you see now is the time of breaking silence, that we are not silent about our pain anymore. And through thinking about respectability politics and thinking about how elders in our community have taught us to be silent, particularly out of fear. And we understand that. But you are talking to a generation that has no fear. So that doesn't apply anymore. And so in being able to process the anxiety and fear and worry of our elders, when we are out and speaking boldly about systemic racism, that this policy is racist, or this policy disproportionately impacts certain communities, and being able to speak boldly about that and be able to back it up with facts, with figures, whatever it is, because, you know, in Western society, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. You know, instead of me saying in my lived experience, this is what is happening to me, I got to measure it, you know? And so we know how to maneuver in all of those worlds. And so in doing that, we are using that as we've been taught to assimilate and to be in particular institutions, how to maintain ourselves in those institutions. We are now using those skills and speaking up. So not being docile, not being silent, and we are speaking up, because if you are silent about your pain, people will kill you and say you enjoyed it. And we're not going out like silent.
Amen. There's so many thoughts directions I could go in, but allow me, lest it not be said, to mention a group called Surge.
Yes.
Showing up for racial justice.
We have Surge here?
Surge folks in the house? All right. So for those who don't know, that's a white ally organization to the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's very active in this area. So for any of you who would be interested in a way to plug in, that's a really obvious one. DC being DC, there are, of course, endless ways to plug into the work of external change and racial justice work. We're blessed to be in proximity to national organizations, many of whom may be represented here as well by some of you, as well as local efforts. Where my mind goes in terms of kind of the interplay between internal work and external work is towards an area that I find still so challenging to figure out, which is how to bridge the gap, not just between black and white, but between white folks who believe these racial justice issues need to be addressed and white folks who don't and who are in full backlash mode. So there's a whole spectrum. Obviously, there's like extreme racist backlash, and then there's a spectrum that goes all the way to folks who don't think of themselves as racist, think of themselves as well-intentioned, but are truly in backlash against Black Lives Matter, against affirmative action, against any claims that they owe anything, who have, if you think of Rush Limbaugh type language, for example, like this idea of takers versus makers. So these very insidious ideas that, for example, black people are playing victim, that they're just playing identity politics, that all has been rectified post-civil rights, and what are they complaining about? There are some very deeply insidious narratives. And because of the way in which we're so divided politically in this country, there's not typically a lot of opportunities for white folks who believe there is work to be done and those who don't to be in conversation with each other. And it's my firm belief that it should not be incumbent upon you to be having those conversations, because those would be painful, I presume.
Yeah. And part of self-care for me is not putting myself in those situations. So I'm very particular, and I ask a lot of questions even about this event, because it is exhausting and it is triggering, and to be able to be in spaces with folks who are sharing, that are in positions of power or with white privilege, and being able to see how they are processing and either coming to terms with realizations that I've known since I was born is exhausting for me, and creates anger and frustration that there's a privilege that you've had to not know all these things, where I've had to teach my 4- and 5-year-old those things. And so it creates a lot of anger. And so I'm thankful that there are spaces, and that Surge creates. I want there to be more healing spaces to be able to have these conversations beyond just direct actions and planning and strategy. There needs to be some spiritual work that is happening, that I'm looking forward to, and calling in people to create, as I create Black spaces for healing, identifying folks, and they don't all have to be white folks. To facilitate those. There are some Black folks and other people of color who it is their path to create spaces for white folks to be able to process, and they can hold that. But my energy is focused on my people and being able to build up the capacity and strength and healing for that. So that is very important.
Yeah, and it calls to mind a colleague, Bimbola, and I see Cassie in the back. We were talking the other day after an event in Richmond, and Bimbola was saying, as a Black woman, when things are revealed, as in this current moment when so much is revealed about what's happening to unarmed Black men, and things are more public and more visible. And women.
Queer and trans.
Yep. Or when this was after I was showing my film last week to some students, and the Black students typically are having a feeling of relief when the history of slavery is being portrayed more honestly. For them, it's relief. It's like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy. It's a relief. And meanwhile, the white students, their whole world is rocked, and they're a mess, and their whole foundation of their identity is kind of turned upside down. So building on this idea of how do we reach out to those white Americans who aren't convinced that work needs to be done, I think another piece that's rarely brought to the fore is the history of white Northern self-righteousness, white liberal self-righteousness. And if you really study the history and you see, for example, the incredible, so not just the complicity in slavery that I described in the North, but for the next 150 years, I mean, the South, the white North sold out Black people during Reconstruction and let it come to a close way prematurely. and looked the other way during the terrorism of Jim Crow and lynching. Going back, the North wasn't even as pro-emancipation as we think we were. So like abolitionists in the North, white Northerners, they were the minority. They were not the majority. The majority didn't want to go south to free enslaved people. So there are all these ways in which the white North has kind of created a self-image and written the history books to flatter ourselves. And if you don't know that, then you just, oh my goodness. When I first started doing this work and I would hear a white person with a Southern accent, I had prejudice. I assume they're racist. I assume they're less intelligent. I don't know how many Northerners and Southerners among the white folks we have here, but I have white Southerners tell me they still feel discriminated against because of their accent, and that is a white Northern arrogance. So once you unpack that, then suddenly the current race politics, we're used to kind of satirizing or using words like deplorables, and just dismissing and looking down our nose at people who are in backlash mode. I challenge other white people to really get at what's underneath that, like the working class anxiety that's underneath that, the way in which white working class and people of color get pitted against each other, and the white kind of upper middle class and upper class kind of get to feel holier than thou. There are a lot of layers to this that are crucial for us to figure out and to address in everything from like the healing circle mode, where you're really working it through, to how we teach history at schools, working on our textbooks and how this history is taught to help students get true history and learn how to talk to each other about this stuff, rather than typically school, when you learn about slavery, is the beginning of the separation, because kids are not being helped to process this incredibly confusing, traumatic, painful stuff, because at the end of the day, of course, race is a fiction. So we're living in the reality of its impacts, and it's a fiction, and how do we hold all of that at the same time, see each other's humanity, see our own humanity, and sign up for getting it right one of these days.
So we have 4 minutes. Is it possible to take questions or not?
If you want to take them now.
What do you think? Sure. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? I saw the first hand. Yes.
I just wanted to add to your comments about the North. The fact that many northern cities were the last to integrate schools as well.
Yeah.
And very few people know this. It was much easier for Atlanta, Birmingham, to integrate schools than New York and Boston. Boston was probably the last northern city to integrate, and in fact, their schools aren't integrated now to a very great extent.
Yeah.
So that's a little known fact.
Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder about the word easier.
Less conflict.
I wonder about that too.
And much longer. Much longer. So, yes, this all.
Yeah, it's just, I'm just telling you exactly what my reaction as a Black person, hearing that, and thinking about, especially having family in the North and the South, and the stories are the same.
And there's all the exodus to private schools in the South, so it's sort of like, we'll just...
Yeah, because they're still I would say the schools across the country are still segregated as well. So, it's just that when I just say and being honest about when I heard that, of having the word easier.
How much law enforcement was required.
All of that.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of guilt to go around. Yeah.
Hi, since we're standing in church, I just wanted to ask for your reaction regarding kind of the silence of so many white and interracial churches on the issue of Black Lives Matter and race in general. I attend, for example, one pretty large interracial unregistered white church, and the responses from the pulpit in terms of Freddie Gray and Mike Brown have been lukewarm calls for unity and peace as opposed to calls for justice and a discussion of what whiteness means. So I'd welcome any feedback you might have on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say it's been my experience sometimes when churches ask us to speak, and then we speak, or I come and speak, I don't get invited back again. That's just real. And because there are so many, there are lots of people that don't know how to talk about this. And again, when you have folks that are steeped in patriarchy, in classism, and all these other things, and the intersections of them, and having them be older black folks or older white folks, whatever it may be, there's a fear there. And the best way that they know how is to just talk about peace in a way, which is actually control. It's not peace. And so it's been disheartening, but it's also been a truth that I've had to accept, that there are some people that are not ready and are fearful of a message of liberation because they don't know how it impacts or affects them. And but there has been the Black UUs. I don't know if you all have seen that most recently. The Unitarian Universalist Church, with our organizers and activists in those congregations, have continued to push, and they have actually committed money to be able to have a convention or General Assembly for Black Unitarian Universalists to address the systemic racism within their faith. They put money behind it because that's also a factor as well of what you value, right? The organizing, they were afforded $300,000 to start organizing, and that the church has committed $5 million over the course of, I forget how many years, to be able to provide the programs to really be able to bring folks like me in to help Black folks process the systemic racism that they're experiencing outside the church walls and within. And so they're doing that personal work as well. And they've been a model. It's been hard, but we've been continuing to push. And there's no way that they could have pushed back against that because, are you with us or not?
I can add from some other denominations that the Episcopal Church, not across the board, but some dioceses have really taken on the work of studying in detail the history of the church's complicity in slavery and its aftermath. And there's something about, I had a mentor who used to say to me, I don't want an apology unless you know what you're apologizing for and you really know what you're apologizing for. So this is a process of the church apologizing and embarking since 2006 on multi-year processes that I would say, aren't typically fast enough or as engaged by as many people as would be needed and crucial. But it is using denominations, white Protestant denominations, having them look at their history of complicity is a great way to sort of ground the work, and like universities are doing, like Georgetown is now doing. And I do want to announce something really important for those who haven't heard about it, which is this idea of truth and reconciliation and the process of tell the truth and then look at the harms and then repair. The Kellogg Foundation, for those who haven't heard, is in the process of initiating a national, what is going to be called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation process. They've basically decided, and this is two Black women at the helm, Dr. Gail Christopher and Dr. LeJune Tabron Montgomery, that why wait for Congress to pass a truth and reconciliation process? When will that ever happen? Let's not wait. Let's create a private nonprofit process. So they already have 100 partners, including lots of national organizations. And I really encourage you, both through your faith networks and whatever other networks, to check that out. It's in the design process right now, but it will be rolling out in the months and years ahead.
I would hope that there's time to maybe talk some different views. I'm one of the older black folks. I'm Colonel Jim White. I'm 83 years old, and I am founder of the Nanny Helen Voters Project. So I would ask all of you to please take some of the handouts that I have of Nanny Helen Voters' views. I'll only make a couple of statements here. My therapist has said to me, Jim, you've got to learn to deal with this passion without pain. Because there is a lot of pain when we talk about Florence, who said in 1900 or shortly thereafter, my grandmother would say, yes, honey, I was in slavery, but I wasn't no slave, I was just in it. They may have enslaved my body, but they didn't enslave my mind.
Yeah.
Now, Nanny wrote in 1900, 12 things a Negro must do for himself. 12 things white folks must stop doing. And I'm going to quit by simply saying that at the National Cathedral, I hear Mr. Wallace speak of white privilege and speak of slavery and America's original sin. But I tried to say to him, every time you talk of white privilege, I want you to talk of opportunity, responsibility, and challenge. So Nanny is basically saying to us, yes, that happened to us, but we are beholden to the past, we're shaping the present, we're responsible for the future. So there's another side of the story where she says, I'm not a victim, and we have responsibilities and opportunities that we must take. Please take my handouts, and I think I'm telling you about Nanny Helen Barnes, who was a Christian woman who started Women's Day in the Baptist Church in 1907.
I apologize, and I do know what I'm doing. But we are pressed for time. I know there's some people who haven't actually registered yet and signed up for certain workshops. And I'm thinking if we get to do this again next year, maybe Erica and Katrina could do a whole workshop actually.